everybody for joining this week. We wanted to, Paul, Linda and I got into a really, really good conversation this time last week. And it was the three of us on the session. And I know we were originally going to talk about kind of more supporting apprentices with kind of more special needs. And I wonder if we can maybe pick that conversation up a bit later, because we wanted to share the conversation with everybody and just kind of make it a bit more interactive and looking at kind of both sides of the coin when it comes to endpoint assessment, because we've not really talked about it that much yet. And I didn't record the conversation with Paul and Linda last week, so I said, can you come back on and have that conversation? Because from Linda's perspective, Linda's the MD of Professional Assessment Limited, so really good insight from an EPAO perspective of everything that's happening at the moment, you know, kind of conversations with Ofqual and remote assessment and all that kind of interesting stuff. And then Paul was talking about his experience of kind of a couple of war wounds, I think, of being you know, assessed and set up as accredited, and how that feels from a training provider perspective. So we thought it would be really good to have that conversation, and then obviously make that a conversation where folk can kind of interact and ask questions. And then between last week and this week, Pal have well, Linda, I'll let you obviously talk better than I will around the telephone service and things like that. So I thought there's some really good stuff we can cover as part of today's session, if that's okay for everybody, and we'll kind of take it from there. So if that's all right, we'll crack on if everyone's happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So Linda, if you want to do a bit of an introduction, and then obviously Paul, most of the folk know you as well, but you know, feel free to do an introduction as well, and then let's kind of crack into, you know, where EPAOs are at the moment and how it feels.
Okay. Well, hello everybody. I'm Linda, so I am the MD, as Erica has already pointed out, of Professional Assessment Limited. So we have been an endpoint assessment organisation since 2018 and have done just shy of 2,000 full assessments. So you think about an endpoint assessment quite often having 3 or 4 components to an assessment, you know, times that by that number. So we've done quite a lot of assessments. I suppose my background, and maybe Pal's background, which sort of links to the helpline, is that possibly the best way to describe me is sort of gamekeeper turned poacher, or vice versa, because I've spent many years in vocational work-based learning and learning and development. So in some ways, a bit like going into training, I hadn't planned in 2017 to head up an endpoint assessment organisation. That wasn't in my, wasn't particularly on my roadmap, but the opportunity came about, and I was interested to see how perhaps an endpoint assessment organisation that wasn't an awarding organisation or didn't come from that background could offer a service that was as robust in terms of the regulatory requirements, but took perhaps endpoint assessment from the point of view that actually we are an assessment centre, but we've also got to offer a really good service. So making the endpoint assessment something, a complete service, so a wraparound service, and very much taking a partnership model, because for me, independence is about separation but not opposition. And I think in the early days of the sort of setup of standards and apprenticeships, and you know, all of the furore around assessment plans and were they good or weren't they good as well, there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of things I think half-baked, which is very difficult to work with, but you've got to start somewhere. So I always felt in sort of even with standards, the first couple of years we were literally knitting the road as we walked. It was quite an iterative process as well. So that's the sort of background, and I guess that my team within professional assessment come from a very wide background. So they're all occupationally experts, and we are quite selective about the standards and the sectors that we work in, because we take that specialism and that expertise very seriously as well. But they've also got that breadth of working in different organisations and with different functions. So one of my directors is hugely knowledgeable on all things rules and performance management rules, because he is an auditor, but he's also worked with the Education Skills Funding Agency. So again, he can offer a very interesting take in terms of that PAL offer. So one of the things that we also do with all of our clients, once they've signed with us, all of our resources are issued straight away. And one of, if you like, the extra resources that we issue is Rupert, who is the Audit and Compliance Director, also does sort of an online funding Padlet that he regularly updates. So I think that's our sort of background. And I suppose that maybe the other difference is, why did we come into endpoint assessment? Because I often say to training providers when they're thinking about who should they use, is actually get the why out of the endpoint assessment organisation, get their prologue. Why have they come into endpoint assessing? Because if I'm very honest, in the early days, some people were going into endpoint assessment because they thought this was going to be a nice way of making some fast money. It's not. I'm not saying it's not nice, but it definitely, you don't make fast money out of it as well. And I think that whole partnership piece, it's really important. Why have you come into this? What is your background? What is your providence as an endpoint assessment organisation? And really, how do you value the apprentices? I think one of the loveliest things my assessors always say is, the assessment is the easy bit. It's all the other bits that, you know, the logistics can be more complicated. But they always say they are so privileged to do endpoint assessments with some amazing apprentices. And, you know, sometimes when I sort of do some quality assurance and I dip into professional discussions, the journeys of some of these people is truly phenomenal. You know, what they've learned, what they've gained from it. And it is a real privilege to listen to how they have, I'm going to sort of take Christine's word, but how they've really flourished as well. So I think that's sort of just a little bit of the background. I think it's still, and I think in terms of endpoint assessment, I think we've still got a system that's work in progress. I think it's come a long way, but it's still got a long way to actually go. But I think there is now, and Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is a greater meeting of minds now between training provider, endpoint assessment organisation and employer and apprentice. And I think for me, one of the key things that I'm also trying to do, which is another reason for the sort of the help setup, is to make sure as well that we don't forget the apprentice in the middle of all of this as well, because I think in some ways we can get so caught up with the process and the regulatory bits, we forget that there's this individual that's got to go through a process which is still quite new to lots of people as well. So I think that really sharing information and being open about what the processes are, what the benefits are, and trying to find, I guess, added value to endpoint assessment as well. So one of the things that we also try and do is actually when we're doing endpoint assessment, particularly if we're working with organisations that have got, you know, maybe several sites and quite a lot of apprentices, is trying to pick out themes, you know, what's really working well, what perhaps it could be finessed further as well, and feeding back some of that. Where is the training really adding value? What's really, you know, what's really sticking with those apprentices as well? What skills and behaviours and knowledge is performing, you know, extremely strongly? Perhaps what areas still need some further work on as well. And I think if endpoint assessment organisations can do more of that, then I think, if you like, we've got that cycle, and we've got that strong sort of collaboration with independence, because an independent assessor doesn't know that apprentice in the same way. So it is very different from doing formative assessment as well. And I guess at the moment, what's happening in terms of standards and endpoint assessment is the reality of COVID-19 is that IFIT and external quality assurance providers have had to take a step back and realise actually that flexibilities have been required, and for them they have moved very, very quickly. I think some others might say, well, yeah, eight weeks is not that quick, but actually for their systems and processes, they have moved reasonably quickly, and they certainly have been listening more as well, and just to get those flexibilities, that's been a learning curve for me, because so many different agencies and groups have had to have been involved. But what's been quite inspiring there is how endpoint assessment organisations have worked together, how Trailblazer groups have worked together, how they've worked with the root panels at IFIT as well. So in some ways, I think the system is in a much better place than it was 3 years ago, and I think there's lots to be built on. And I think one of the key things is to keep talking and to keep talking with everybody that's involved in the system to try and get the best we can get, because certainly in the apprenticeship world, where the whole system is only as good as all of the players. So if we want excellence, it's got to be excellence across the board, and I think certainly that's the perspective that professional assessment comes from. And just again, in terms of that help, it's just sometimes just being able to take information and just interpret it simply. Assessment plans sometimes aren't the easiest thing to understand. It's sometimes people are still not clear whether they can be in training and furloughed or go through endpoint assessment as well. And we're just fortunate enough to have a collection of people that between us all, we can normally answer those questions, or we can find somebody very quickly that knows the answer to that. So that's sort of where we are in terms of endpoint assessment. We're probably one of the middle size endpoint assessment organisations. So we work with 17 standards. So we're not one of the big players, but we're certainly not one of the niche players either as well. And we're looking at new standards, but we're sort of keeping within our remit. We will only work with standards where we feel we've got some providence and expertise. And I'm very sorry if you just heard a grunt there, but Evil George, my black Labrador, is beside me and has just gone into doze mode.
Linda, that's fine, and I'm still waiting for a picture of Evil George, so I'm glad that he's with you.
Well, I will try.
Well, I have to say I went on mute because my cat was meowing around as well. So.
The wonders of home working.
Indeed.
Linda, thank you. I think that kind of gives us a really interesting and a good overview of kind of PAL and the work that you've been doing. Let's get into the conversation of how it feels practically, because last week you and Paul were both talking around two sides of the same coin and what's happening actually for EPAOs at the moment, the challenges around remote, and Paul, I know you've got real views on kind of how this feels from an ITP perspective as well. So Paul, do you want to kind of talk about some of the stuff that you were sharing last week, and then and between you guys get into that conversation? And again, if there's any other questions, queries, guys, any thoughts, just chip into that conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi everyone, Paul Conroy. I'm the co-owner of Next Group, so we actually have a couple of training providers, and we're actually in the process of setting up an endpoint assessment organisation, and I'll come on to the reasons for that in a moment. But Linda and I had a very good conversation last week and shared some experiences and some ideas. And actually, Linda, I wouldn't describe you as a gamekeeper or poacher. I'd suggest that you're a custodian.
Oh, thank you very much.
Such a gentleman.
In terms of endpoint assessment. But I think absolutely we've come a long way in the last 3 years with endpoint and with the new world of apprenticeships and the sort of rationale and reason for endpoint assessment. And I don't think there's the debate or conversation about whether that should happen or not. It's in place, and that's the process that we're all following. And certainly from my perspective, we're happy to follow. I think as part of that transition over those 3 years, there are a number of holes, as I would describe them, still in place. We know that from August 19, the guidance changed whereby training providers were not allowed to enrol learners onto a standard where an endpoint assessment organisation was no longer in place. I think for me, for a long time, I've been arguing the point that actually a standard shouldn't be signed off until an endpoint assessment organisation is in place. But we are where we are. Erica described a few war wounds. Those war wounds, one in particular with one standard that we deliver, and we are quite niche on the energy front. So with the Junior Energy Manager, we're one of only 2 providers offering that, and we're the only national training provider to offer it. And when it was originally released, it was one of the first cohorts of Trailblazers signed off. An endpoint assessment organisation, an awarding organisation called ProQual, actually applied for or was successful as the endpoint assessment organisation. We worked very closely with ProQual to make sure that we had everything in place in terms of our delivery model and supporting apprentices. Unfortunately, ProQual 6 months later decided to pull out because they realised at that time we were their only customer. So it was very niche and clearly wasn't a viable option for them to move forward. So we were left with no endpoint assessment organisation, and we worked again in partnership with the Energy Managers Association, and it took them some time, but they eventually put their application in and were successful around, I think, May, June last year. So we've worked with the Energy Managers Association. What that caused was a lot of confusion, both for us as a provider, employers and apprentices about endpoint assessment. So we had, those of you who are involved in apprenticeships and also the paperwork and the bureaucracy around apprenticeships, we've had to chop and change various agreements and contracts and so on around that. And actually the ESFA's guidance has changed over those couple of years in terms of what's expected to be recorded, to the point where when we had an internal controls audit with the ESFA in February this year, there were a number of things that were highlighted, and I think it's important that other providers are aware of that. And actually the ESFA's guidance was incorrect according to their own auditors. So that's one of the war wounds that Erica is alluding to. And the fact of the matter was that even though we had proof of the email exchanges with the central support team at ESFA in terms of what we should and shouldn't do at the time, that was in contradiction with what the auditors believed their interpretation of the guidance was. So the resolution for that was that they accepted that we followed, we sought advice, we followed that advice, but actually we still have to make those corrections with regards to making sure that they are in line with the advice we were given by the central audit team. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that there is no standard process for endpoint assessment organisations to engage with training providers, with apprenticeship training providers. So we work with a number of endpoint assessment organisations, some of which say you must have a contract in place with us. Some will even say you must go for an accreditation process with us before you can use us. Others will say, we just need you to notify us 3 months before Gateway of your learners, and we'll issue contracts at that time. From the auditor's perspective, again, although we could evidence that we've had conversations with employers, we've had conversations with endpoint assessment organisations, they stated that if you have an endpoint assessment fee in your contracts and agreed with the employer, a contract must be in place with the endpoint assessment organisation. If you don't have that contract, then how have you actually negotiated and agreed that fee with the endpoint assessment? And one of the rationale that the auditor gave, and I understood where they were coming from, was if you're on a 2-year programme, what's to say that endpoint assessment organisation's fees haven't changed 2 years later when that learner gets to Gateway? which is quite reasonable and quite understandable. So there are a number of things that we need to think about as training providers when engaging with endpoint assessment organisations that might inadvertently disadvantage us for whatever reason, but actually we think we're following the process and we're following the audit guidance at the time, that actually will fall foul of potentially at a later date. The other thing I will say is that we came out of the audit fine, but endpoint assessment was a particular issue for us with some of our learners with some endpoint assessment organisations. And that was the disparity for us, was we work with some where they've got clear guidelines and we follow them and where, shall we say, bulletproof in terms of audit. And then we work with others where they're not clear and there isn't clarification and we're left open. And that's the difficulty that I find as a training provider. And then when we try and negotiate with those endpoint assessment organisations, the feedback we get is, that's not our process, that's not what we have in place, that's not what we use for any of our contracts. And then the other conversation that we had with regards to the current situation of COVID-19, and it's really good to have those conversations with Linda, is absolutely, we are all, including endpoint assessment organisations, following the lead and the guidance that's coming out from Ofqual and DFE. And that includes endpoint assessment organisations themselves, it includes awarding organisations, particularly around exams, so GCSEs, A-levels, etc. And obviously the ESFA. And there is no direct guidance or decision making being made by the ESFA. They are simply passing on or regurgitating the guidance that comes out from Ofqual and DFE. So the ESFA in these circumstances are not the go-to place in terms of that guidance, in my opinion. And actually, when I'm speaking to endpoint assessment organisations, we've got learners at Gateway now, we've got learners going through Gateway, we've got learners about to go to Gateway. And again, that advice is differing per endpoint assessment organisation, which is quite frustrating for us as a training provider to try and make sure that we have as consistent and standard approach to endpoint assessment as possible.
Would it be helpful if I sort of picked up on some of those points as well? Because I clearly can only talk in some ways from PAL, and I can't talk for every endpoint assessment organisation as well. But I think again, in some ways that there have been some painful lessons in terms of a standard now, if you like, being allowed to be, if you like, on the system and with an assessment plan and with apprentices being registered onto that programme. What the ESFA now has in place is there has to be an endpoint assessment organisation in principle. So what happens there is if an assessment plan is due to be signed off, and again, that's quite a regimented process. I mean, Christine would know a lot about taking a standard through from naissance to getting it, onto the IFIT register. But the ESFA will request for an endpoint assessment organisation in principle. You respond, so you have to basically sign off a declaration if you are that endpoint assessment organisation, and you have to give them a specified time when you will be ready to deliver. Now, you have to do that when you make an application anyway as an endpoint assessment organisation. You're normally asked in your application, when will you be ready to assess this standard? 3, 6, 9 months as well. So they have learnt from that as well. And ideally, of course, they never just want one endpoint assessment organisation, because that is quite risky as well. That is still, in some cases, the case, particularly perhaps with niche standards as well. But if you look now at the range of standards, and there's about 550 odd standards, for those standards there is normally at least 2 EPAOs, and some of the sort of higher volume standards, you've now quite often got 10 or 12 endpoint assessment organisations, and I think the choice will be a good thing. So that's maybe the lesson learnt there. And sometimes we are chasing the EPAO principle. Sorry.
Can I just chip in there as well? I think the onus is being put back on the leadership groups a little bit to engage with potential EPAOs to make sure that they are being in place. Because going through my own experience, and you make me smile, Paul, battle scars, quite a few battle scars. I'm not sure Linda knows of the journey, but I've been part of the education and training standards. So that was a long and painful 5-year journey that's still going on. So yes, a few battle scars there, but it was always quite low level. You were encouraged to talk to AOs, but it wasn't something that I think is now much more important, and it's being forced a bit more that leadership groups have to connect with appropriate EPAOs in order to have them in place. And I just think it's so important. It's so important, going back to what you were saying, Linda, about the learners. At the end of the day, it's the apprentices that suffer. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's definitely one thing. I suppose that the other thing as well that they brought out last summer was the EQA framework. Now that's been slightly modified since then, but the EQA framework was designed to ensure that all 20 odd EQAPs, external quality assurance providers, if you like, regulated the endpoint assessment organisations in the same way. There is greater standardisation there. Is it identical? No, it's not. So in some ways, and I absolutely understand where training providers come from here, is that in some ways endpoint assessment organisations have to obviously respond to the requirements of the specific EQAP that oversees that standard or set of standards. And if they are different, the EPAO, even on, I work with several EQAPs, and they're not all quite the same, or they will focus on one particular aspect of delivery maybe over another. But I think that their focus always has been, understandably, around the actual assessment process, as opposed to maybe the whole end-to-end offer. So again, somebody like an organisation like PAL, because we were used to contracting, and because we thought it sort of made sense that you would have a contract with the training provider and you'd have a contract with the employer, because you'd want that transparency and you'd want people to be very clear about what the costs were, how those costs were made up. That was an approach that we always took, but that wasn't a universal approach at all. And for many EPAOs, that the contract was with the training provider, and they were quite happy, as were training providers, quite happy to act on the employer's behalf. And I know also when I've spoken to employers, certainly in the early days, they were very happy for the training provider to choose the endpoint assessment organisation. So I get Paul's frustration, because when you've got that sort of environment, how do you negotiate? I mean, what do you do if you're a training provider in a very large organisation says, just sort it out for me? You choose, and we'll go with that. What I have noticed from employers now is that they are getting much more savvy about the whole process and endpoint assessment, and are wanting to be more selective. I was talking actually to one of the big hospital trusts that has many apprentices, and she was saying, and she has very good relationships with the training providers that she works with, but she said, yeah, at the beginning I was not really looking at who the endpoint assessment organisation was. Now I want to be part of that negotiation. I want to be part of that process. And I want to hear from the endpoint assessment organisation what endpoint assessment is going to be like. Because what she found was, in some cases, again, it's interpretation. The interpretation from the training provider's perspective was different from the endpoint assessment organisation's perspective as well. So I think, again, employers are, if you like, helping to smooth the way, but there is the EQA framework that has been changed slightly, because we've obviously got a consultation that's just closed actually on what the regulatory framework should look like, and I think most of us are anticipating that we will move from many EQAPs to two EQAPs, one for higher education and off for pretty much for everything else. Ofqual are a very different body to the other EQAPs as well. So again, I think that is going to be interesting, and I think that's going to have an impact as well on the market, because actually at the moment Ofqual are only the EQAP and regulator for about 30% of the standards, and actually I might be even being generous there. So that means in effect 70% of the standards currently are not regulated by Ofqual. If you look at the number of endpoint assessment organisations, and that's sort of again around 300, only about 60 of those are Ofqual accredited at the moment. And for a lot of us, we would happily go for Ofqual accreditation, but we can't. And we can't go for Ofqual accreditation at the moment because we don't offer their standards. We don't offer their standards because we're not Ofqual accredited. So we're in that sort of zone at the moment. And I have spoken to Ofqual about this, and they've said, no, you know, we are aware of this, and there is a transition plan in terms of how they will move, if you like, people over to that sort of single state, should that actually happen as well. But the EQA framework has been helpful. It has, I think, started to ensure that the assessment process is reasonably standardised, and I think there is definitely a push to have very clear pricing, very clear transparency in terms of contracting. And actually, if you're an endpoint assessment organisation, getting notice even 90 days before that somebody's going into endpoint assessment does put pressure on logistics. I mean, we sometimes get notice 9 days before, but I think it's a better way of working if you have that relationship early on as well. I suppose the other aspects that have been a challenge for all of us at the moment as well is furlough, and how do you work with people when they're actually in furlough, and remote assessment. But I have been hugely and pleasantly surprised around remote assessment, and when I say that, I've been hugely and pleasantly surprised by how well apprentices have adapted to remote assessment, to remote invigilation, where I thought it was going to be maybe a struggle, and particularly in certain sectors, they have performed really well. And in aspects of professional assessments, such as professional discussions, again, I thought, that they may find this even more challenging doing remotely. That's not been the case at all. If anything, they seem to have been better prepared, more focused, and have performed really, really well. So I think, again, it's not going to go back. I think some of the flexibilities that have been introduced may stay. And I think in terms of remote assessment, I think that is going to become far more typical and commonplace than it is now. And I think when we come to the review of assessment plans, those assessment plans that have got observations in, and I work with a lot of those standards, I don't think they will be completely removed. I think certain apprenticeships you absolutely need to do observations, but I think the duration of the observation might be looked at, and I think certainly if it's a more managerial type standard, I think again that the nature of that observation might be looked at. So for example, at the moment, if you're a hospitality supervisor, which is a level 3 standard, there is 4 hours of observation. That's a lot of observation. That's 2 hours of prepper service, 2 hours of delivering service. It's not necessary. It's not needed, that duration. And actually, in terms of assessing their supervisory skills, really you could see one or the other, or you could see them doing a briefing or something like that as well. So I think there's going to be definitely a move to do more remote assessment, look at how the assessment plans can accommodate that, look at, again, you know, the capacity to do digital recording. And I know certainly, and again, Christine, I'm sure you will know this gentleman, but I know, for example, when I talked to David Gallagher at the NCFE, he's very much saying, that the whole process being it's almost as online as it possibly can be. So I mean, he's all for Uber assessment. Basically, you should have, if you like, just in time, on demand assessment. And I do think, again, that is going to have to take place as well. We're going to have that sort of flexibility. So we're not going to work in sort of your academic years as well. So again, I think for an endpoint assessment organisation, that ability to offer responsive service is critical. And 24/7. I was talking to a training provider yesterday based in London that works with Asian restaurants, and they pretty much do work in the evenings. So the only time you're going to be able to assess them is in the evenings. Well, you've got to work like that if you're an endpoint assessment organisation. So I think those are some of the changes that are happening, and I think endpoint assessment organisations are realising they've got to be more flexible and attuned to business needs.
Just on
I
something
think sorry, just to jump in on what you said there as well, Linda. I think one of the things that needs to be learned and not forgotten about is very much around those flexibilities that you were talking about. But this pandemic caught us off guard. We were left on the back foot, and we've been scrabbling around for 8 weeks to try and put things in order and get things that they can operate. I think that is a really serious lesson to learn, that we can be responsive in times of crisis. And I think the only way that we can be responsive in times of crisis is by having those flexibilities in place. So I think some of the flexibilities that have now come in need to stay. They need to stay in order for businesses to be as responsive as they need to be in times of crisis. Because I'd like to hope that we never see anything like this again. I was going to say in my lifetime, but because I'm sort of nudging towards the latter end, there's probably not that much left. But, I was reading a really interesting article yesterday about the countries that are coming through this the best are the ones who've already had something like this. So they've already had to deal with things like SARS and stuff like that. So they already had these plans in place. And I think if we lose what we've gained, then that's going to set us up badly for the future. So sorry, just thought I'd chip that.
No, absolutely. I would agree with all of that. Well, so
Adam, I think you were going to jump in with something.
I was, and I can't remember exactly. Oh, that was it.
Sorry, Adam.
No, it's all right. It was around the involvement of the employer in selecting the EPAO at the end of it, and I think that has definitely come on a lot in the last sort of 2-3 years as standards have been around. And I'm just interested to know how EPAOs are actually cutting out the provider and talking to the employers directly. I know that in several instances, I have to submit bids and tenders and whatever, and actually it's specified by the employer which EPAO they are going to use. And I wondered how EPAOs are actually approaching that and looking at it as they're partnering with the employer to make sure that their EPAO meets the needs of that employer, and then the training provider has to provide the training to get to that stage. I think that's happening with NHS trusts, for example, who have got the buying power, they've got the volume to be able to do that, but they're not the only ones. There are private sector companies who are doing the same. So how are EPAOs adapting their employer engagement to kind of meet that demand?
I think some are doing it again very, very well, and they are still working with their training provider clients, and they are looking at the employers that they're working with as well. That they're looking at everything at LinkedIn. That they're looking at, and certainly there's more and more employer providers actually as well coming through the system as well. So I think there are some EPAOs that are very active on that front. There are some EPAOs that are still, if you like, really relying on the training provider as well. But I think when I talk to other EPAOs, and we do talk, for them that is they are doing more and more employer engagement work. But I think from an EPAO's perspective, you've got some very important stakeholders that you have to work, and you have to be able to work with all of them, and that is the training providers, and that is the employers. And you still have to bear in mind as well that the apprentice is also a key stakeholder, although you might not engage with that apprentice until the final stage of their apprenticeship, which is the endpoint assessment as well. So I think that's really it's sort of standard client relationship management stuff as well, but it's maybe for some more traditional AO EPAOs not something that they had done a lot of before, because the natural relationship was with the centre, which could be training provider or college as well. So I think it's really important to try and keep that tripartite relationship going as well, and work with, if you like, with that triage of people.
Good.
I think it's always going to be, even though the employer pays one way or another way or whatever, there's always going to have to go back to your point about relationships, Linda. I think that's if you commercialize this and take funding and apprenticeships and everything out of it, the customer is the learner effectively, aren't they? The apprentice. And I think sometimes, like you said, we lose that quite a lot. I've just done a big deep dive for an ex-British Gas friend who's now taken an L&D role in a big trust, an NHS trust, and I've audited all of their providers, and it's reminded me how unsavvy, uncommercial some providers are. I've been brought back to my days of kind of, there's an assumption that you're going to pay me through the levy, so I don't need to give you any reporting. And why are you bothering getting in touch? What are you bothering me for? I've got training to deliver, So I think the whole sector's got quite the way to go. To not everybody. I'm not whitewashing everybody, but there's some pockets that are still very far behind, I think, in terms of thinking.
And I think the other thing that's probably to be remembered at the moment as well is how EPAOs get paid. So at the moment, the money is still channeled via the training provider. Now, there has been ongoing discussion, it seems to have been for at least 18 months now, that they were going to change that as well. So that clearly influences negotiation and relationships, as does funding. Certainly when you look at work-based learning, funding is very key in if you like, setting the culture and the climate as well. So if that changed again, so if they ever do bring in, and I think it's very unlikely we'll see it this year, but if they ever did bring in that, if you like, the endpoint assessment aspect of funding was a direct transaction between, if it's a levy payer, the employer and the endpoint assessment organisation, I think again that might influence relationships as well. But you would still, for the apprentice to have a really good positive experience, the endpoint assessment needs to be a natural positive finale, not suddenly this shock horror, I wasn't expecting this. And in order to do that, you've really got to have good partnership working throughout, and a good understanding of the whole system, and how those key stakeholders work, and the expectations and aspirations of those key stakeholders as well. So I think that's why the process, of course, is important, but all of those other bits are equally as important to get the right experience, because it should be a positive experience in apprenticeship. That's what it should be, and any of us involved in that can either make it positive. We can be saboteurs or saviours, can't we? So we can either really make it one of the best things that they've ever experienced and sets them up for life, or we can knock them down in the knees and set them on a road of dissatisfaction and anxiety as well. So I think it's there's lots of stuff that's not about process and contracting, but about how we work.
And again, Linda, you're absolutely right. Just picking up on that point, for us, and I know we spoke about this last week. We do interim endpoint assessment days with our learners, so to best prepare them for the endpoint assessment process, so that it's not a shock to them. It perhaps won't come as second nature, but as close to as possible. and we introduce those every quarter. And they do effectively the equivalent of an endpoint assessment on what they've learned so far. So they build up that the knowledge and the skills and the evidence of, and are able to follow whatever the endpoint assessment requirements are. And that really helps our learners, and it really benefits them. We invite the employers as well, and they really like it because it gives them a showcase for what's happening. But again, it's that inconsistency. So when I come back to endpoint assessment organisations, and I am being general here, but where you have a process where you have to engage up front, you have to go through an accreditation process, there is a full support package for you as a provider, the employer and the apprentice throughout that journey to best get them prepared for endpoint, versus just let us know 3 months before gateway.
Yeah.
There's a huge void there, huge difference. So when we talk about consistencies, I think we absolutely, there is some work being done on the legislative side and on the funding side and on the guidance side, but more needs to be done to bring that across the board so there's consistency. But then the way in which endpoint assessment organisations themselves operate, there must be a consistency there, and there isn't at the moment. And it's left to, dare I say it, ITPs and colleges and other providers, employer providers and the like, to fill those gaps. Because none of us want the apprentice to get to endpoint assessment and fail.
No, absolutely as well. And I think that there is a gap there. And again, in some cases where you haven't got lots of EPAOs, you can't make that choice. But I think those points that you've just raised there, if I was an ITP again, I would be, all of those points you've raised there would be on my checklist, and I would be asking the EPAO, what do you do in terms of this? Do you come in and do briefings? For example, we do briefings with training providers. We will also go in and do briefings with employers as well. We absolutely encourage mock assessments and formative assessment, because it's critical in terms of development, and it's critical in terms of feedback, and really making sure that the apprentice knows what they're really excelling in, and knows where they perhaps need to just temper or refine their performance for endpoint assessment as well. I think one of the other things that we think is very important in terms of endpoint assessment is the quality of the assessment records and the feedback that we actually provide as well, because again, those apprentices step up to the plate. Nobody's going to help them out in the endpoint assessment, so it is high stakes assessment as well, and they absolutely deserve to get good feedback that really allows them to take that and go, okay, that's great, I've done that, maybe I still could still work on that as well, but again, something that's really positive. So again, if I was tendering for an endpoint assessment organisation, I would be very interested to see the style of assessment feedback that they actually give, and they can show you that, they can redact certain things as well, because I think that's important. It shouldn't be just a tick box exercise. It should be something that the apprentice can take away and go, right, I'm really proud of this, and I know what I've got to maybe evolve and develop in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think again with the sort of the leadership trailblazer hat on, providers that we've been working with to support them in the apprentices that they want to put through the standards that we've developed is very much, right, okay, this is the assessment plan, this is where you need to end up. So whatever awarding organisation or endpoint assessment organisation you're going to be working with, you need to know what their expectations are. So you need to begin with the end in mind. And then the whole process needs to be set up to take the learners from where they are at the beginning through to where they need to be at the end, with checkpoints in between. And a lot of the standards that we developed have all got themes for assessment. So it was about recommending that those review points that progress against the themes are being reviewed, so that these apprentices can see how far they've travelled towards where they need to be on a regular basis. And that supports them in their development. So when they come to do endpoint assessment, you're absolutely right, Linda, they're on their own. You know, they've got to be able to stand up and say, I can do this, this and this, which meets the knowledge, skills and behaviours of this standard. And this is how I've done it, you know. It's all, again, it's all down to the apprentice and giving them the confidence to be able to do that in whatever form it takes. And every apprentice is going to be different, so their journeys need to be different. And the challenge for ITPs is that, and colleges and whoever employer providers, is if you've got a mix of EPAOs that are expecting to do different things, and you're trying to work with employers doing that, then it can be a real challenge. But at the end of the day, the knowledge, skills and behaviours within the standards are set. The assessment plan is set. It's just the journey to get to that end point. Sorry, I'm a bit on my soapbox today, aren't I? this is my field as well, you see. So.
And do you know what? I look back to 2016-17 when we were writing customer service 2. And we were one of the first standards to go through, and we didn't have a clue what we were doing. We knew what good service looks like. We knew what great L&D looked like. You know, I had some experience in apprenticeships, but we were one of the first standards. And, you know, we would submit our assessment plan to what was the DFE. The IFAC didn't even exist at that point. And the feed, they didn't know what was going on because they didn't know what EPA looked like. And those standards are still, and I know they review every 3 years, etc. But I look back, I read that standard sometimes, I think, did we really submit that? Did it really go through? So I really feel sorry for you guys kind of assessing that, because I'm sure some of it probably just doesn't make sense and you have to kind of interpret that in the right way.
And I think
the decisions we made, we didn't understand the impact of.
No, talking to some of the AOs that have been thinking about adopting our standards, you know, they ask different questions for points of clarification, because now they know they've got to put that into the documentation, that they are advising providers that are going to be working with those. But, you know, with the best will in the world, because we were slightly different, because a lot of us had got, because we were from a training provider background, we got that teaching and training knowledge. So we tried to make it really clear that nobody could misunderstand what we were saying. But still, there's misunderstandings and misinterpretations. And you're right, it's so hard to do, to put something out there that makes sense to everybody.
And when we did 2 and then not so much 3, but when we started building 3, there wasn't such a thing as an endpoint assessment organisation. We brought in the City and Guilds and the Pearsons and providers and awarding organisations, but nobody really knew what endpoint assessment was at that point. So I think there needs to be kind of a review of all of this now with some really clear guidance based on, Linda, everything you were saying around the frameworks that you guys have got now in place. You almost need to start from where we are and unpick some of it or rework some of it, I think, don't we, to make it easier for everybody.
And I think in part that's why they're looking for, if you like, one EQA provider for endpoint assessment organisations. Now, whether that will be the answer, that will be interesting, because Ofqual's got many good facets and points. But I would say very, very strong in terms of regulation. Whether they fully appreciate that sort of that whole customer piece, I think that's perhaps a territory less familiar to them. And I think it's just getting that bit right, and it can't. And it is really difficult, because even with a good assessment plan and a good standard, and you are working with individuals ultimately, and even something you think would be universally understood, it can be understood, but it's not necessarily universal. So, you know, my understanding might be X, Y, and Z. And I think, again, that's why that communication at the beginning is so important, because it's important that the training provider and the endpoint assessment organisation that's selected for that particular standard have the same thought processes and the same interpretation, and that's established at the beginning of the journey, and not, you know, at the 11th hour if there is any divergence, you can do very little about it. And again, who suffers when that happens? It's the apprentice. So I think again, there is a responsibility for endpoint assessment organisations to be very clear about what their interpretation is. And one of the things Ofqual will introduce, and we actually write them anyway, but they are looking that there will be you will have to have a more detailed specification, which you have to have with qualifications at the moment. So I think that will be something that if it moves over to Ofqual, there will be a much more prescriptive specification for each standard that will, if you like, sit behind the assessment plan.
Which is great, yeah. And I remember writing that for both the customer service ones, but then we picked up the leadership and management ones, expecting a specification to be there. No criticism of that trailblazer whatsoever, but it was a million miles away from all the time and effort we put into customer service. So I remember British Gas thinking, well, hang on, where's that piece of work? Why is that not around? So yeah, really.
And that's been actually, you mentioned leadership and development. Probably team leading and operations departmental manager standards, which are two of the most popular standards with quite a few EPAOs. Those are the standards that in some ways where we've probably seen inconsistencies.
I can imagine.
And in part it's because there wasn't that specification sitting behind it, and EPAOs went ahead and doing what they thought was the right thing, but nobody pulled them back in and go, hang on, let's have a look at this. Before you go out to market. So hence you had endpoint assessment in various hues.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Linda, tell us a bit around the support service, the telephone service that you guys have launched.
Very quickly, because I'm very mindful of the time. So really the support service, it's a helpline. It's open to anybody and everybody as well. Just really in terms of, and the help there is for work-based learning delivery, and it could be if you needed help on things like audit and compliance, Ofsted, interpreting an assessment plan, interpreting some of the new flexibilities, knowing where to go to find, is there an EPAO for this particular standard? So it's that sort of helpline as well, and it's just there for anybody and everybody as well, and it's manned by 5 different people as well. So the core team, 5 different people as well, and they just pick up on those calls and those emails and respond, and that's what we're doing. And I suppose it's just in part PAL's bit for the current situation as well, and that's why we don't mind where anybody comes from, because again I come back to, if the system is to work, everybody has to be excellent. And we all need to be sharing that information, and if we can do that, we are happy to do that at the moment as well. And there's lots of other help out there as well, but I guess ours is perhaps in some ways a little bit more informal. We're not going to make any judgments. We're not a formal regulatory body or anything like that. So you can phone us up and maybe ask the daft question. Which won't be a daft question, but it might be a question you wouldn't necessarily want to ask the SFA or IFIT, or even maybe your own EPAO or AO. It might be, I'd quite like just to get somebody else's take on that, and we're happy to do that.
That's amazing. And where would we find that information? On the website, on the PAL website? It's
on the PAL website. It has been posted on LinkedIn and stuff as well, and it's got a dedicated free phone number, and it's also our info@professionalassessment.co.uk email as well. So it's out there, and we're responding accordingly as well. So
have you had many emails or calls to it yet?
We've had actually about 20, which surprised me. As well, because I was actually looking, even if we don't get anything, it's fine, let's just set this up as well. And in most cases it's been around flexibilities and the furlough, and not surprisingly functional skills, that type of thing as well. So yes, and we've had a few employers that have called us where, if you like, they're still at work but their colleagues have been furloughed, and their colleagues would normally deal with the apprenticeship delivery side of things. So again, it's almost been could you explain this to us, because we're not quite sure. So, and again, we've happily done that where we can. We're quite careful about what we can say or what we can't say, and where and we will signpost people as well if we think, hang on, no, you need to actually be talking to your own provider about this as well. So we've had about 20 calls.
Linda, if you need my support with any of that, then more than happy to.
Oh, it's lovely of you. Thank you so much, Christine. That's great. Well, really appreciate that.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think that's just over 11 o'clock, isn't it? Is there any Paul's final thoughts? I'm going to come to Paul, kind of like Jerry Springer style, but Paul Conroy's final thoughts. Paul's very conscientious and very considered in his sharing. So thank you, Linda, so much for sharing all of that. I think that's given everybody some really great insight into what's often, I know you say the bottom of the food chain. I know you call it that sometimes. I don't agree, but it's often not considered in the way that it should be. So thank you very much for that.
No, thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Linda. And I think this is why these conversations are so important, because there's so many good ideas and lots of good practice and lots of good things happening. But actually, you say at the bottom of the food chain, they need to be moved up. My final thoughts on that consistency, again, with endpoint assessment organisations, and some of which have been mentioned during this session, is they're really good at sharing their experiences and their best practice, and quarterly updates in terms of endpoint assessments that have taken place, what's worked well, what's not worked well, common themes, trends, etc. That's really important for that information to be fed back to providers to influence their delivery models, to impact positively on the apprentices. So absolutely it all comes back to the apprentice, but we need to have that consistency of approach and communication to enable that to happen. And I think the more conversations we have like these, and the more that our experiences, our suggestions, our comments, and that good practice is fed up and taken on board, I think the sooner we'll get to a point where we do have that consistency and that best quality of service and delivery by all parties.
Good point.
Agreed. Brilliant. Right, thank you. Christine, Adam, anything from you? Any thoughts?
No, I've just been a very interested listener. I don't have much to do with EPAOs in terms of my role in sales, employer engagement. So basically dialed in to help inform me about the process to make sure it does go easier when I am doing that upfront business engagement. So yeah, it's been really interesting, just sat listening, and apologies I've not contributed a little bit more.
No, that's fine, Adam. Good to see you.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that is so crucial with, and what I love about this group, Erica, is that the mix of ideas and backgrounds of people. I think conversations happen in pockets. So independent training providers might get together and talk, colleges might get together and talk, EPAOs might get together and talk, but it doesn't necessarily influence and impact what's going on in the wider world. Linda and I were talking yesterday, and she's alluded to it this morning, that she's poacher turned gamekeeper, or gamekeeper turned poacher. And I think that's another thing that a common ground that we share, because we've got background and experience in different areas. So I've worked for a small training provider and a national training provider, and I've worked in industry, public and private sector. You have different viewpoints, and it's really useful to know what's going on in those different places. So I've really enjoyed today's conversation. I think it's really good to know what's going on in the wider world, because it does impact everything, especially the learner.
Christine, that last 10 seconds, I'm going to capture that as a mini promotional video for our group, I think.
Wow!
I just love the way you were talking about the benefits of kind of coming together and collaborating. And
I just say then, for future reference, please don't ever ask me to repeat anything, because it comes out of my mouth. That's it. Well, I can't remember what I said.
I'll be playing around with my video editing software, putting all sorts of wonderful things around you later.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, for dialing in. Thank you so much for your time. Once again, great. Like you said, Christine, I think you summarised it really nicely. It just kind of brings in different viewpoints, doesn't it? And let's just keep spreading the word. I'm going to do some more advertising around the group as well and put this link out for people to watch back and stuff, so we can get more people engaged as well. So that would be great. Thank you, everybody, so much. Great to see you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good day, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.